Good morning and welcome to today's webinar on men's mental health. Today's webinar is being offered by the Behavioral Health Quality Department and Behavioral Health Medical Directors. Today's training will be led by psychiatrist Dr. Subroto Ghosh and licensed clinical social worker Greg Lujan. If you have questions for the presenters, there will be time at the end for questions. Please type your questions in the Q&A box. Thank you. And Greg, take it away.
Good morning, everyone. Next slide, please. I would like to start us off with the thing that everybody is very excited about, our disclosure statement. I won't bore you by reading the whole thing, but please take a moment to peruse it. Just making sure that we have all the T's crossed and I's dotted here. And this presentation will be available to you online after the presentation. So if you want to reread the disclosure statement, you may. Next slide, please. A little bit about our agenda today. We're going to talk about the landscape of men's mental health. We're going to talk about some clinical considerations, including, and this presentation will be done through the lens of follow-up care, particularly after someone has first been diagnosed with substance use disorder, hospitalization, an ER visit, that sort of thing. And then we'll talk a little bit about patient screening and practice. And so to start us off, Dr. Ghosh is going to talk a little bit about the landscape of men's mental health.
Okay, thank you, Greg. So I'll start off by, why is mental health important? And really, mental health shapes how we experience being human, right? Influences how we think, how we feel, how we connect with others, how we make decisions, how we experience the world, and how we find meaning. So when it comes to men's mental health, there's some differences in how psychological distress presents in men. So for example, how men seek health, how that distress might be recognized by providers or even missed by healthcare providers. So one of the big challenges is that men typically don't go and say, go to their PCP and say, I'm feeling depressed, I'm feeling sad, I'm crying. That's not how a lot of men kind of go to the present with. Instead, they might have symptoms like being angry more often, irritability, withdrawing from families, using substances, other ways in which these symptoms might present. So with that framework in mind, let's look at the broader landscape, how common these problems are, what the gaps are, and some of the differences in presentation. So on the next slide, please. So according to the Anxiety and Depression Association of America, in men over 18, half of these men with a mental health illness receive treatment. So these are stats from 2023 from the ADAA. In addition, only one in 10 men experience some form of depression or anxiety, but fewer than half of them seek treatment. And when they do seek treatment, oftentimes symptoms have been more severe, or they might be in crisis, things of that nature. So in other words, behavioral health conditions are often go unrecognized and are undertreated in men. So we can go to the next slide, please. So when untreated, mental health issues can impact the person, impact their life, impact their productivity. In school, lower scores, not going to school, truancy, getting involved in the legal system. So it's been estimated that serious mental illness, which includes depression, bipolar disorder, psychotic illnesses, can cost up to $193 billion in lost earnings. Importantly, I think, like there's a high comorbidity between mental health and physical health. The two are really linked to each other. For example, let's say depression. Okay, depression and diabetes. When someone has diabetes, if they have comorbid depression, they likely have poorer glycemic control. They have more adverse events, high morbidity, and mortality. There was one study by the University of Washington a few years ago, and they found that when people with diabetes present to their primary care, only half were recognized as having comorbid depression during routine care. Next slide, please. Yes, we can put this into perspective with a few numbers. So in 2019, it was estimated that about 1 in 8 people had some kind of a mental illness. So this slide by the CDS, it tells us that 9% of men in the United States have daily feelings of depression and anxiety. So this is not like an occasional bad day. This is persistent symptoms every single day over time. So 9%. So out of 100 men, 9 men struggle with this every single day. And there are some differences in age and race. So in the age group of 18 to 44, Black men and Hispanic men reported fewer symptoms of depression and anxiety compared to white men. Report fewer symptoms, but that does not necessarily mean that there's less illness, there's less depression, anxiety. It might just mean that there's less reporting of symptoms. Let's see. Can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, so this is an important slide. This is on suicide. So men have a 4-fold increased rate in committing suicide, in completing suicide. So you see on the graph on the right, and this is a consistent trend that seems to be creeping up over the last 20 years or so. The top line, the dark line is for males, the green line for females. So men have 4 times higher risk of actually completing suicide. Women, on the other hand, actually have a higher risk of attempting suicide but not completing them. And once someone has made a suicide attempt, the risk of having a future attempt is 3-fold. Next slide, please. Okay, and so we talked about depression and anxiety. This is a slide on substance use disorder. So men are 2 to 3 times more likely to have substance use disorders than women. So substance use disorder would include symptoms like unable to control the use of substances, even though someone might want to stop, they're not able to stop using. Its social impairment impacts their life, their work, home life, social interpersonal skills, placing themselves in risky situations. And alcohol is the most commonly abused drug. And so the depression, mental health issues, and substance use issues are linked with each other. And breaking that cycle can be an important part of treatment. So go to the next slide. Oh, Greg, I think this is yours. Yeah.
This is me. Yeah. So thank you, Dr. Gose. I want to talk a little bit about traditional masculinity's impact. And I do apologize. We don't have really the depth in this presentation to go into intersectionality, although we will talk about age and generational traditional masculinity and the way that different generations approach treatment therapy. But I want to talk a little bit about the way men in Western society have been called upon to react, to act, to behave. And I think a lot of times we talk about we talk about toxicity, and I want to kind of remind everyone that toxicity is, with anything, is about dosage, not substance. For instance, a little bit of salt sprinkled on your steak tastes amazing. A little bit of salt on food really brings out the flavor in it. A couple of tablespoons of salt or a half a cup of salt will make you sick. Um, so kind of thinking about masculinity in that way. Masculinity has been a very healthy, functional thing for our society, has been a very healthy, functional thing for men in creating the safety that we have in this world now. It has been a very healthy, functional thing in creating the structures and a lot of the infrastructure that we have, right? Protection and hunt, and securing of resources, and all of those things have been very beneficial to humankind, and that hasn't been without its rough points, without its pain points, right? So when I talk about traditional masculinity, I think in terms of fundamentally the ability to stop and hold and compartmentalize an emotional experience, and to put that off to the side in order to get something done, particularly where one's life and one's compatriot's life might be at stake. Not to over dramatize it, but that's kind of, it kind of comes down to that, right? If you're arrested by emotion, if you are, taking the time to kind of process your emotions while something dangerous is happening, you're on let's call it a bison hunt, why not? If you're doing that, you do run the risk of not being able to take care of yourself and take care of the people next to you. And so thinking about it in terms of function, and in a society now where we aren't really hunting bison, we aren't really going out and securing resources in a very dangerous way. That kind of puts us at odds sometimes with our nature. Um, so with that in mind, we talk about healthy traditional masculinity. Healthy emotional expression might not be modeled. This is still carried on and passed on from generation to generation. What is found attractive in men, what is found appealing about men, isn't necessarily our ability to sit with and steep in emotion and and do that. So men may cope through distraction, social isolation, substance use, and overwork. Um, Men, to some extent, are still expected to be the strong ones and prioritize self-worth and value, as being the primary, or as being the primary provider, I should say. Um, so in a world where men are increasingly called upon to be, with our feelings, and sit with our feelings, it's creating difficulty for some men, or a lot of men, and we're kind of at odds with what our caveman brains still tell us to do and want us to do, and the reality of the world we live in today. Again, I'm not sitting here at my desk hunting bison. I'm sitting here, you know, analyzing quality data, metrics, and whatnot. Next slide, please. So, according to the CDC, there is some stigma, and of course, stigma does tend to reduce engagement. It can lead to delays in seeking or discontinuing care. Um, we do have to kind of face up to the idea that the way we approach therapy has a very strong feminine component to it. It has a very strong, let's talk about your feelings, let's steep in your feelings, let's stay with your feelings, which can be very difficult for a lot of men to do. Men are more likely to be diagnosed with externalized mental health disorders, such as substance use disorders, ADHD, conduct disorders in youth, versus internalized mental health disorders, things like depression and anxiety and eating disorders, that women are diagnosed with. Again, these are disorders that kind of push feelings away, as opposed to kind of internalize and kind of let them eat at you inside. Preventative health and primary care services are often underutilized, my man. We don't tend to go to a doctor unless there's something wrong. We don't tend to try to solve a problem that isn't a problem. So if you have a pebble in the shoe might just feel like a pebble in the shoe metaphorically, might just feel like a pebble in the shoe at that point, not necessarily something that you stop and you take off the shoe and you do all the things for. Pardon me, if you can fight through it, right? So when we talk about things like follow-up after someone's been in the hospital or they've been to the ER for some sort of event, or they have a new diagnosis of substance use disorder, it's really important to get into treatment as quickly as possible. And we'll talk a little bit more about what the brevity of treatment or the discrete impact of treatment. But when someone is newly diagnosed or when an issue is identified, it's really important to get somebody in, ideally within the next week, within 7 days, and get a couple of sessions in within 30 days when that happens. And next slide. I'll turn it back over to Dr. Gose.
Okay, thanks, Rick. Can we have the next slide, please? Okay, so I just wanted to touch on one aspect of like the etiology of psychiatric illnesses, say depression, for example. So these are mental health issues, are brain-based illnesses, right? These are medical conditions in which the brain are involved. It's not a sign of weakness or like personal shortcomings. In men, for example, they might think, I just need to try harder, I need to be tougher. But the brain is an organ much like any other organ, right? If you have like heart disease, it's not that you have to try harder. There's something wrong with the heart, or some impact on the heart. Same with kidney disease or diabetes, right? You don't just try harder and your diabetes gets better. So similarly, psychiatric illnesses are brain-based illnesses. The brain, however, it's a very complex organ, like from the developmental standpoint. So these are three brain regions: the amygdala, prefrontal cortex, and ventral striatum, that are known to be involved in the etiology of depression, right? And so, as our brain develops, our brain develops from right from in utero up to the age of 25. So brain development takes a long time to complete the maturation, and adolescence is a period of important neurodevelopment. It's also a period when a lot of psychiatric disorders first become clinically apparent. We have a time when brain maturation is occurring. Now, for these three brain regions, for example, the amygdala, which is involved in fear, the fear response, and the ventral striatum, which is involved in the reward system. And the ventral striatum, whenever we think or anticipate or experience something pleasurable, the ventral striatum lights up. Right? So the amygdala and the striatum, these are two regions that mature earlier, right? And the prefrontal cortex matures later. So what the impact is that we can kind of think of this, think of the adolescent brain as a car, and this has been described in the literature. They've used the brake gas pedal analogy. So the emotional and reward systems are like the gas pedal. They become highly active and responsive during adolescence. The prefrontal cortex is like the brake, which helps in judgment, impulse control, emotional regulation. So the point here is that the gas pedal develops earlier than the brake pedal. Right? The brake pedal develops over time, but it takes a while. So the impact is that during adolescence and early adulthood, people might take more risks, more impulsive kind of behaviors. They don't have the control to manage those things. Now, there's some evidence that the female brain actually matures earlier than the male brain. They reach structural milestones earlier: cortical thickness, gray matter volume. So a few years earlier, so the female brain kind of matures sooner than the male brain. So, this has an impact. This might have an impact in the biology and in mental health disorders. But the point I wanted to make for this slide is that psychiatric illnesses are brain-based illnesses. Um, um, they're not illnesses. They're not a matter of willpower or like pulling your socks up. But these are real illnesses with biologic bases. So we can go to the next slide. Oh, there's also testosterone here. I missed out on. So in men, serum and total and free testosterone levels in men peak about second, third decade in life and then decline gradually. Now, in older men, testosterone treatment might improve sexual function, muscle mass, strength, power, and maybe some moderate effect on depression. When we look at epidemiologic and observational studies, the data are mixed. Now, like hypogonadal men with low mood and low testosterone would benefit from testosterone. So replacement in those individuals might be helpful, but it should be taken as a issue separate from depression. Testosterone is not a first-line treatment for depression per se in men. So we can go to the next slide. Okay, so we talked about how men might not present with the typical symptoms of depression. Usually the symptoms of depression include depressed mood, low energy, low concentration, problems with sleep and appetite, inability to focus, feeling helpless, hopeless, those kind of symptoms. But there are other symptoms that might indicate that a person has depression. For example, like some of the common ones are listed on this slide. Like a man might come in saying he's more angry and more irritable, kind of isolating themselves. Here we have escapist behaviors, spending most time on sports, gaming, using alcohol, drugs, high-risk activities. And again, all those activities are ones that kind of stimulate the ventral striatum. So it gives person, provides some pleasure. So in a way, they all might be kind of trying to reverse the symptoms of depression, some of these behaviors. Or they might come in with physical health complaints, headaches, GI symptoms. So not the typical symptoms of depression, but other symptoms that might provide clues that the person is struggling with some mental health issues. So we go to the next slide. Greg, I
Hi,
think
everyone.
yeah.
Yeah, that's me again. Kids these days. We're going to talk about some of the generational differences between how young people are approaching mental health, young men are approaching mental health, and how kind of older people might experience it, and what they might have been taught about mental health. And I, as a father of two Gen Z kids, am really enjoying this subject. And I really enjoy looking at how my kids approach mental health. They don't see it. They generally, Gen Z kids are 14 to 29-year-olds right now. They were born between 1997 and 2012. And in this cohort of kids, a lot of them have had experience with mental health treatment, have had therapy, have had, pardon me, have had some sort of emotional health training. So they generally, mental health and therapy are normalized. And this is one of those kind of kids these days things, right? A lot of older adults will kind of will participate in the stigmatization of mental health treatment. So it is normalized. They may have had prior therapy. Following up with them or getting them follow up, you can be generally a little more direct about therapy, and you can frame follow up as a standard for wellness, generally speaking. although there are some conflicts within this age group. I think sociologically speaking, it's interesting right now. Um, because there's some backlash against this as well. And you'll always get generational backlash against what each generation is learning and what each generation is doing. Um, they are very astute in terms of their digital media and behaviors. They're very particular. They can be very particular. My own kids, just talking about my own children, and I know a lot of children are very pointed about what social media they're on, what social media they're allowed to, what their internet exposure is. My own kids didn't want me posting pictures of them on Facebook for the longest time. And what they asked me to do, and I was very impressed by this, they just asked me not to put any pictures of them on my Facebook page without their permission. And it took me a second, and I kind of had to stop myself and say, what is that all about? Are they just being little nudges, and no, they really, it is a survival skill. It is a strategy. They have to be careful about what their public image is, because now we all have a public image, for better or worse, right? We all, if you're on the internet at all, you are presented to the world in a way. And so it's very interesting. And of course that plays into their mental health. What they're, this generation can't do something as simple as go to a dance and ask somebody to dance without the understanding that somebody could be recording that and putting it on the internet, live streaming it. So it's with that in mind that you want to approach this generation. Um, they can tend to also be information avoidant when they're overwhelmed. So when dealing with overwhelming emotions, they might tend to avoid input of data, which can be remembering things like remembering appointments. So if they're provided a packet at discharge, a paper packet, you might want to use teach back methods, provide quick visuals like a mini calendar, and then warm handoffs whenever possible, to give it kind of a human touch. Um, and you want to follow up with simply discharge plans, like we said, mini calendar, all of that stuff. Um, pardon me. I have a bit of a tickle in my throat and I have a cough drop in, so I apologize for my cough if it happens. The impact of the pandemic. These are kids who were younger and in school during the pandemic. We saw a lot of increased anxiety and depression, decreased and maintained. They have decreased and they have maintained low substance use. This generation just isn't really drinking alcohol as much, which is great. We'll take it where we can find it, right? They do less risk taking, but they do have higher mental health service needs. And you might want to do things like, when following up with them, you might want to use text to email reminders. You want to avoid phone calls. Anybody who has a Generation Z kid knows good luck getting them to answer the phone with their voice. That's just not going to happen, but they will answer text messages. It's the primary way through which they interact with one another. And then things like their lifestyle and environment need to be taken into consideration. They spend more time at home, and their family is their key support system. A lot of these kids are slower to launch than prior generations have been. So it may be then that follow up with this generation does involve a little bit more family, and at home supports, not only in therapy, but help with reminders and logistical support. Pardon me. Next slide, please. Millennials. These are our 28 to 43-year-olds born between 1981 and 1996. They do have, this generation did have high rates of depression and anxiety and a lot of stigma. There's a real rub, and we'll talk about Gen X, Generation X, my generation, and as kind of this forgotten in between generation of people, but millennials and baby boomers have this real friction between them. I think the millennials were able to give voice to what my generation wasn't really able to understand. We know we were disaffected. We just didn't know, we didn't fully understand why. Millennials are able to elucidate it. Anyway, millennial men tend to show higher rates of depression and anxiety compared to previous generations of men of the same age. This was the first really treatment savvy, really tech savvy generation. So despite their destigmatization of mental health, millennial men are less likely to seek mental health treatment, even when they're symptomatic, as stigma around emotional vulnerability persists, although somewhat less than previous generations. Their follow-up, you might want a structured, actionable, and concise approach with the use of bullet points. This is a generation that got a lot of information really fast with the invention of the internet, right? They're our first generation that always had well, they didn't always have the internet, but for the most part they did, right? Growing up, they had the internet. As opposed to Gen Z, which has never not had the internet, never not had all of the information in the world at their access at all times. So the millennials were the first generation that really, as kids, had to deal with being given all of the information in the world all at once. So you want to keep it organized and concise. Millennial men, in terms of work stress and financial strain and burnout, they tend to experience high levels of work stress. Financial strain and burnout are often tied to job instability, student loan debt, and economic pressure. You have to remember that Gen X was the first generation that reckoned with, well, we'll talk about that in a second, but the millennials really have lived an entire life knowing that they probably weren't going to settle into one career, one job with one company, build with that company, promote within that company, and then retire from that company. They've known this all their lives. They've known that their resume is something to be built and developed over the course of a lifetime. So their approach toward work and their work related stress is going to be different from that of say a baby boomer, and what that reputation looks like work wise. Many millennials report declining social network and increased loneliness. And again, it's that switch to the digital age. Millennial men report strong links between stress and mental health symptoms. And again, when following up, you want to schedule a follow-up. You consider the stress of the availability and the need for flexibility, and not to add to their work-related stress. This is a generation that was told work harder, work harder, work harder, work harder. I think Gen Z kind of gave up on the whole work harder thing. So it's a little bit, it'll be what the next generation of tech gives us. But with millennial men, they've been told you just need to work harder, get a second job, do this, do that, and they have taken that to heart to some extent. And there's been, of course, backlash against it. Alcohol use did elevate a little and was used a lot to cope with stress with millennial men. They tend to show elevated post-pandemic alcohol use and high rates of stress-related drinking. They don't identify stress-related use as a problem with functional impairment until there's functional impairment. So kind of that traditional thing, right, where we don't recognize it as a problem till it's a problem. As opposed to, I recognize that I'm developing some symptoms here and dealing with those as a problem. And they are of childbearing age, right? So they're having trouble with competing responsibilities these days, having to balance raising kids and caring for aging parents. Millennials parents tended to be slightly older. And as the generations go on, parenting tends to be a bit of an older activity as opposed to younger people. So they're dealing with caring for aging parents and parenting at the same time. And then males in this generation have the competing responsibilities of work and caregiving as younger people, and absolutely for the better, as younger men are becoming more engaged with parenting, becoming more of a driver parent as opposed to a babysitter, babysitting one's own kids. So it often leads to prioritizing family responsibilities over follow-up care and treatment. So again, due to competing responsibilities and scheduling with consent, involve their parents. It might in scheduling, their parents might need to also be copied, or they kind of might have a whole family approach to things. Next slide. Okay, Generation X, my generation. Um, so we're that first generation that we were told that we were going to be the first generation that made less money than our parents, and there was a definite shift in our in society kind of with this generation. There was tremendous cultural change through Generation X. And again, these are 46 to 61-year-olds born between 1965 and 1980. So we lived through disco and the sexual revolution and punk rock and gangster rap and a lot of really fertile societal changes happened during my generational time. And so we're kind of this generation going, whoa, you know, what just happened? What is all of this? And I think there was a lot culturally and a lot in terms of popular culture that gave my generation fodder for rebellion. Whereas I think Gen X and millennials, or Gen Z and millennials, don't have as much with music, as much with that sort of thing. And so they tend to take on more serious issues. So with Gen X, things like an increase in substance use disorders and related health issues with substance use disorders, especially as all of our hard living kind of caught up to us. We have been often referred to as a neglected or forgotten generation. Our generation did involve some parents, a lot of parents stepping out to work, with both parents working, and millennials as well, kind of latchkey kids and stuff. But we tend to think of Gen X as kind of neglected. So trauma might be unrecognized or untreated, and self-medication through substance use might be the biggest reason. Due to age increase and physical health issues, it's further complicated by substance use and vice versa, of course. Let's see. There is something of a decreased likelihood when seeking therapy and treatment. Gen Z kind of has therapy might need to be, particularly with men, might need to be discreet. It might need to be, we're going to do 5 sessions and we're going to work on these things and we're going to kind of call this an accomplishment. And then after 5 sessions, we might want to reevaluate what we're going to do and renegotiate the contract. So it feels like it's work. It feels like it's something discreet. It doesn't feel open-ended and just like it's going to trail off into the future. I think that'll help kind of speak to men of this generation a little more. Gen X men have something of more of a willingness to seek alternative services over behavioral health treatment. Pardon me. I've had a cough all weekend, and so I apologize for that. So this includes things like acupuncturists, chiropractors, massage therapists, herbalists, support groups, either online or in person, self-help groups, spiritual or religious advisors, or telephone hotlines. Gen Xers are kind of open to more of a huge field of possibilities. We tend to be more accepting of psychotropic medications over inpatient or outpatient treatment. So we're more accepting than generations that are elders. Certain follow-up care considerations. You might want to consider a collaborative care model, referring to a PCP or office or clinic that can provide aftercare, especially due to increased risk of health-related issues to substance use and their general decreased likelihood of traditional therapy. You want to screen for substance use disorders and And again, get people into treatment as quickly as possible after first diagnosis, after hospitalization, after they've been in treatment, after they've been in residential treatment, that sort of thing. You want to use brief therapy approaches to increase the likelihood of continual attendance. And you want to integrate alternative approaches, as we mentioned before. On the next slide. Okay, baby boomers and the silent generation. We'll talk about kind of two generations at once here. Your 62 to 80-year-olds and your 80 and older, born between 1946 or 1928 and 1964. These are our elders. These are our kind of really traditional generation. This was those generations were that real. In some ways, they were lucky in that they came of age and did their work and made their living at a very fertile time for the world, post-war Reconstruction. There was a lot to be made, a lot to be built, a lot of progress to be done. There were really good jobs for men back then where you could go out and you could do a blue collar job, or work in a factory and provide for a family. And that was your place, right? That was your job. Your job was, and there was a noble purpose to it. A lot of them felt, or most people felt. Of course, there's also kind of a downfall to that, which we'll talk about in a second. But the ability to go out and do and produce and bring home and secure the resources and hold on to that as a purpose, as a meaning. That said, men age 75 and over have the highest risk of suicide rate, and it's 3 times higher than the national average. Older men at risk of suicide are much at risk of suicide if they're widowed or divorced. Living alone in a nursing home or have a history of anxiety or depression, and they may have lost a sense of dignity and control. These are, and we'll see what happens with future generations, but these are men who really, really had a sense of purpose and were defined by their purpose. And not to kind of generalize, but generally speaking, of course, everybody's individual experience is going to be different, and everybody's individual experience is going to be rich, and you should always pay attention to that. But this is a thing to pay attention to there. The purpose is what it comes down to. I think men of elder generations, particularly, once they lose a sense of purpose, they tend to lose a sense of self. Of course, you know, with an aging population, you want to think about chronic health conditions, having conditions like heart disease and stroke and cancer that cause depressive symptoms, or medications that can have depressive side effects. It may make it harder to identify depression itself. Living with a chronic illness or comorbid or medical or neurological illnesses also can increase one's suicide risk. This generation notoriously has low mental health utilization. Both generations are the least likely amongst all to seek therapy and medication for mental health. SAMHSA data shows lower treatment utilization in men over 60. There's a strong cultural stigma rooted in generational norms around stoicism. Be a man, be tough, be independent, be self-reliant. And again, these are very noble characteristics of a man. These are great things that a man can be, and men can do them well, but they happen to our detriment sometimes, particularly if we're so caught up in being a man that we don't stop to let ourselves be human. They may have unrecognized substance use disorders, and they may be chronic. They tend to go unrecognized and untreated, but they do rise amongst this population. There's a tendency for providers and others to think that they're unwilling to treat treatment or services. So recommendations may or may not be heavily encouraged, or may not be made or heavily encouraged. Sorry. Their diagnostic criteria may not be met for treatment resources, but to be needed. So things like smaller amounts have a bigger effect. Quantity time may be spent, less quantity and time may be spent using their therapy services. They may be having social disconnectedness and inactivity due to their age, and so social and interpersonal problems might not be as transparent. People might not see it. And then we talk about things like chronic pain and sleep issues, depression, and anxiety. And again, they may be using substances to treat their own symptoms on this one, or just to feel better. Safety planning in terms of follow-up care, you want to look at safety planning. You want to be direct with depression in this generation. Review their medications, review their access to high-risk situations like owning firearms or high-risk items. And you want to monitor for social isolation and functional loss. Since older adults rarely initiate self-initiate care, direct provider to provider transition might be helpful and will likely increase the likelihood of a follow-up. Comprehensive assessments, so complete assessments that take into consideration cognitive screening, medication review like polypharmacy, and substance use and mental health. This population is the most avoidant to traditional therapy. So you might want to reframe it somehow and think about it using words like health follow-up, adjustment support, wellness, recovery coaching, instead of using therapy, and integrate non-stigmatizing supports alongside that. Spiritual counseling. A lot of the older generations might be more religious and have religious beliefs that will really be good supports for them to help feel better, to help alleviate stress and anxiety. Okay, next slide, and turn it back over to Dr. Ghosh.
Okay, thanks, Greg. Can I have the next slide, please? Okay, so we talked about how symptoms are underreported and can be under-recognized. But there are a few validated quick screening tools that can be part of the routine workflow. So, for example, is grouped into 3: substance abuse, anxiety, and depression. The CAGE screen. The CAGE is a quick 4-question screen about alcohol use. C is, has anyone told you to cut down? A, have you felt annoyed by criticism? G, have you felt guilty about your drinking? And E, have you ever needed an eye opener in the morning? So that's a quick screen for alcohol use disorders that we can use in the clinics. The CAGE aid is modified to include substances besides alcohol. Then we have the GAD, the GAD-2, and the GAD-7. So the GAD-2 is a 2-item questionnaire. And the 2 questions that are asked are, have you felt, in the last 2 weeks, have you felt nervous, anxious, or on edge? And the second question, have you not been able to stop or control worrying? So these are 2 quick screening questions that can pick up anxiety in some patients. If there's a positive response to the GAD-2, then you do the GAD-7, which is a more complete assessment. Similarly, for depression, you have the PHQ, the Patient Health Questionnaire. 2 questions: over the last 2 weeks, have you been bothered by little interest or pleasure in doing things? And number 2, have you been feeling down, depressed, or hopeless? So again, a quick screen that might allow us to pick up on something else that's going on. And then in addition, these screens can be used in follow-up treatment to see the progression in treatment. For example, if a PHQ score goes down with treatment, then we can kind of track the symptoms. So go on to the next slide, please. Greg, is this yours too?
This is me, yes.
Yeah.
And we're going to run a little short on time, so I apologize if we'll be okay. In terms of, because I've talked about a lot of this already, but so some of this will be recap, but let's talk a little bit about patient engagement. And kind of with men in general, we've talked about it not needing to seem like this open-ended thing where we're going to delve into feelings and we're going to stay with those feelings and we're going to just really steep in those feelings. that can be a really terrifying prospect for a man. Um, when our biology tells us, you know, if you're going to get into this feeling thing, get it in there, get it done, get it resolved, and get back to business. Get back to a normal homeostatic state, right? Where we can go and complete tasks. So you, generally speaking, want to think in terms of discrete. There's going to be, let's do 5 sessions and see where we're at, kind of thing. Let's work on some specific things, that gives structure to the idea of and then some safety to the idea of getting into feelings about things. So um, you you want to consider using informal and culturally appropriate languages, and direct discussion. Um, and I know that can be difficult for us as clinicians to do, but you know, I think with men you want to lean that way just a little bit more. You want to, of course, encourage and consider the patient's story and experiences. Build trust in a collaborative and provider-patient relationship, and focus on treatment that is collaborative and action-oriented and solution-focused. And again, and you know, probably not going to get into talking about culture much at all here, but just generally speaking, with people of different cultures, it's best to speak more formally and respectfully until invited to speak less formally. Um, with men, again, give direct suggestions, ask their thoughts, not feelings. First, focus on the what. Focus on, um, you know, what happened, what occurred, what is this, what is that feeling, and then as you ease into the feelings, you can kind of delve into them and let them be with the feeling state in that healing way. Um, yeah, and kind of stay to task oriented, or return back to task oriented type of treatment. And I'm saying this is a very general statement. Everyone is different. Everybody has different needs, and every client is different. So please don't ever, please don't ever take that to be like this is the package for how it's done. But when you see it as a clinician, learn to recognize it that way. Next slide. Some other practice considerations. Um, so you want to understand what prompted the patient to seek treatment. Again, concretely outline the next steps and expectations. Strengths-based approaches. You want to emphasize coming to treatment as a success and as a sign of strength and courage. That is a very, you're dealing with men, you're dealing with somebody who's in a particularly vulnerable state, when they have admitted that they need help with something. It can be a very difficult thing for men to do, to admit that they need help, to admit that there's something not okay with them. Because it taps right into, of what use am I to the world if if there's something wrong with me, if there's something broken about me, if there's something that needs to be repairing or fixing. And listen to how I'm even talking about it, right? As though there is something that needs repairing or fixing. So it helps to think about it in those terms. It helps to think about it in the terms that the men bring to the therapy itself. um, you want to use evidence-based practice guidelines. You know, some of the best collected are the American Psychological Association's guidelines for psychological practice with boys and men. That's a great one. And then also consider continued education, your own continued education. Of course, our knowledge of everything is incomplete, and just kind of keep up with the latest research on everything. Let's see. Next slide. So, and again, kind of challenging traditional masculinity myths to improve care. It is a bit of a myth that men don't want care. It's a bit of a, it's just that um, we want to be able to fix things. Um, and so the therapy might, instead of this kind of real delving into feelings and delving into the metaphor of things, it might be much more male directed. I'm saying what it is, as opposed to and it's more of a collaborative relationship, a back and forth between myself and the therapist. You want to reframe help seeking. as something that really does take courage, that really does take guts, a lot of guts. It's one of the more difficult things that a man can do, is to admit that something is amiss or wrong, or um, that they need to work on themselves just for the sake of working on themselves in any way. Um, so you do want to kind of really lean into that. You want to improve men's mental health literacy, because a lot of times men won't have spent a lot of time considering their own mental health and how to keep their mental health healthy, how to just do mental health hygiene. Um, Build targeted support. The way men tend to approach relationships is tends to be a little more task oriented. I think any men know, or we've all known those guys that have friends that they haven't spoken to in 15 years. But if they need that friend to show up and help them move stuff or build something, that friend is there. That friend will show up and do all of that. And so understanding the way support works for men. Men might not have that constant person in their life that they can call just to kind of talk about feelings with. And so on that note, you might want to consider connecting them with peer support, and building support networks that can be that for them. And next slide. And as we start to wrap up here, you will have access to this presentation, and so with it are some short videos created for our members about behavioral health care and support. You can scan the QR codes with the phone camera to access the links, and you can share these with patients in your waiting rooms, or share the links in your patient portals, or their discharge paperwork. And Spanish captions are also available on these. So. And that is about it for our presentation. Christy, do we
Right.
have any
Yeah.
questions in the? Yeah.
We do. And I just want to make a quick note before we get into the questions. So, for all of our attendees today, thank you again for attending. You will receive an email link 24 hours after this presentation ends to complete an evaluation and an attestation in order for you to receive your CME and CU credit. So, once you complete those, then you can receive your credit. As Greg mentioned, you can also get a copy of the slide deck and download it at the same site that you registered for this training. But one of the questions that came up, so whether, I'm not sure either of you that want to take it, can you touch on how clinicians can best structure with Gen Z and millennial clients when they choose to add AI tools like ChatGPT as a treatment partner to work together? Thoughts there?
Greg, do you have any?
Sorry, I was talking with my
Yeah.
microphone muted. I turned it off to cough for a moment, and I forgot to turn it back on. I think fundamentally it's information. And I would treat it probably similarly to the way you might treat if somebody's reading a book that's speaking to them in a certain way. Or if they have a religious practice that means something to them. I think that as AI is developed, I think what we're understanding about AI is that it's really good at taking a lot of information and summarizing it. It can be very good at that, although it's not without its faults. I think we've all had the experience of looking at the AI summary of something and going, oh, that's not quite right. So it can have gaps in knowledge. So you're going to want to encourage your clients to do that, to just keep in mind. And Gen Z and millennial kids tend to be pretty savvy with this sort of thing. Or at least a lot from my own kids and their friends are like, AI. They don't really trust its. They don't see it as gospel. I think your older generations will see it as a little bit more reliable. We come from that, like, somewhere between believing like they can't put it on TV if it's not true kind of thing. But use it as a tool that can get a lot of information really fast. I think what we're all seeing and we all need to do as clinicians is pay close attention to the effect that it is having, because we don't really know. But I think I see it as something that has the potential to be a very strong therapy adjunct. Dr. Ghosh, anything else on that?
No, I think that sounds good.
Yeah, awesome. I know we're already at the top of the hour, so I did just want to, give the reminder again that you will be receiving an email link to complete the evaluation and attestation 24 hours from now. And just really appreciate all the information today that you both shared. If you had any issues with accessing the audio, these webinars are all being recorded that we're holding this week, and so that you can access it anytime. And just really appreciate everyone showing up this morning and for the great content. So thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.